and I work for the Bloomsbury Classical Studies for Schools marketing team. This is our 4th De Romanis teacher webinar, and you can find all of the previous webinars on the companion website, and then we have a tab on there called webinars. So if you've missed any of the previous webinars, please do go and check them out because they're great. We're joined by 2 of the De Romanis authors, Catherine Rajici and Sonia Kirk. So thank you so much for joining us, both of you. The webinar today is focused on Book 2. All our previous webinars have been focusing on Book 1 as we've been introducing De Romanis into schools. Now that it's fully embedded in quite a few schools around the country, we're moving on to Book 2. So whether you're thinking about moving on or whether you're just starting De Romanis, you're in the right place. In a minute, I'm going to pass over to Catherine and Sonia, and they're going to talk you through all of the features you can find in Book 2, talk about some of the companion websites, and then a little bit about the course in general. Some of you have submitted questions, so we'll ask those at the end. I don't expect this to be a very long event. I know it's evening for everybody. So we'll go for about 30 minutes, if that's okay with you two, and then I will take questions for the remaining 15 minutes. And it's going to be a very small, intimate event today. So if you want to ask a question, please do raise your hand and we can ask it at the end. So please come on, this is your opportunity to ask the authors questions. So please do. I'm going to be quiet now and hand over to Catherine. Are you leading first?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. Right. Thank you very much. I'm going to try and open my screen share, and hopefully you will now be able to see the presentation that I'm about to run. Is that all working okay in terms of visibility?
All good to me.
Excellent. Good. So thank you very much, Sarah. We're here to talk about Book 2. And we're here to talk about moving on to Book 2 in particular. Book 2 is very similar in structure in many ways to Book 1, but it does have some things that are quite different in nature. And we thought it might be useful to frontline them in a webinar like today's. I'm going to talk about the overall shape of the book and the language syllabus within it, and then I will pass over to Sonia to talk in more detail about the cultural content, which is there in Book 2. So first of all, just like Book 1, as I said, the overall design principles of Book 2 directly echo those of Book 1. And the most important of those design principles is the idea of the concertina structure, that it's possible to open the book out to fill the time you have available, or to compress it like a concertina to make it tighter and quicker if you have less time available, or you have students who need to spend a lot more time on certain core things. And the 3 strands that play into that concertina structure, just like Book 1, is that at the heart of every chapter is the core language material, where the new Latin work is outlined and practiced. And within core language, every new grammar point can be practiced either by sentences or by the Latin stories. There is, running alongside the core language materials, the additional language materials, which offer an alternative way to practice the new content. And just like in Book 1, the additional language materials are set at varying levels of difficulty. So the A sentences, the A material rather, is always the most straightforward material. B gets a little bit more difficult, C gets more difficult still. And that range of different difficulty points is what gives the language materials their flexible design, so you can choose the exercise that's going to fit the enthusiasms and the capabilities or needs of your students. Working in partnership, though, with that language material is, of course, the very important introduction and the sources to study section. And that's where the culture and content comes to the fore. Just like in Book 1, the introduction and the sources to study are there to give the grounding for the Latin story, so that when students read the Latin stories in the core language, they're already alert to the types of material that story is dealing with. But the introduction and sources to study sections also give a lot of opportunity to stretch that concertina out and spend more time on matters of cultural interest, discussion questions, creative tasks. And there's a lot of material in our teacher's guide about how to really draw out of the cultural and context material as much that is as interesting as possible. Also, just like Book 1, is the fact that Book 2 has a very close fit with GCSE. And when we designed this course, we wanted to do something which was the most efficient route to GCSE we could manage, so that teachers wouldn't need to waste their time on things that were kind of extraneous to the GCSE project. So just like Book 1, we progress through GCSE material, And it means by the end of book 2, it's possible for students to then have a very smooth progression right up to GCSE, either by using, for example, essential GCSE Latin to finish off the remaining bits of the language syllabus, or it's possible just to kind of glide in to Latin's GCSE Volume 2 by jumping in to chapters 7 and 8. Quite a lot of the content of chapters 7 to 8, those are the first 2 chapters in book 2 of Latin's GCSE, is covered by De Romanis, so there's not actually a huge amount left to do by the time book 2 ends. That said, particular to book 2 are its own distinctive flavours. And the first is that the culture and context material is quite different in nature from book 1. And as Sonia will talk about in more detail, whereas book 1 was very much a kind of topic-based study, let's explore the topic of the Olympian gods or the topic of Roman heroes and be willing to kind of stretch our stories through time. Book 2 follows a much more linear march through Roman history. And the rationale behind that was we were really keen for students to have a sense of the shape of that timeline by the time they got to the end of book 2. So they were clear that Roman history is a story that stretches out over multiple hundreds of years and changes very much as it moves through that timeline. We deal with all sorts of things within that timeline. We deal with political history, we deal with oratory, we deal with warfare, we deal with wealth, we deal with images, we also deal with the provinces. And where possible, we try and do these things in a way that doesn't just tell the story from the Roman perspective, but also encourages students to think about the impact of the Romans on others. And the chapters on warfare and the chapters on the provinces give us a very good opportunity to think about the Roman story from the point of view of the victims or the conquered, as well as the point of view of the kind of glorious, in inverted commas, Romans telling their own story. In terms of the language syllabus, the things that are particular to book 2, the big new events linguistically that come to the fore, are as shown on the screen in front of you now. Pronouns come in, that's the big kind of news of chapters 7, pronouns. We build the passive in from chapter 9 onwards. Chapters 9, 10, 11 and 12 deal with the passive. And it's worth my saying that there are diminishing quantities of new material as book 2 progresses. And that was a very deliberate design choice. We thought that actually it's worth doing less new material as the vocab builds. Obviously, each chapter brings in 30 new words, just like book 1. But we wanted to embed within book 2 opportunities to consolidate previous grammar and previous vocabulary in a very systematic way, so that as students move through book 2, they really are making the overall grip on Latin language stronger, as opposed to just putting more and more in the mix. And I'll talk a bit more about the language syllabus design in a few moments. So jumping then straight off on that idea of consolidation, the stuff that is really new for book 2, that wasn't there at all in the design of book 1, is, as I say, this very explicit focus on consolidation. Now, consolidation is there in book 1 as well. I remember in a previous webinar talking about the fact that every single chapter uses every single word from every single previous chapter in book 1. So all the words from chapter 1 appear also in chapter 2, they all appear in chapter 3 and so on. But in book 2, where the quantity of material is bigger, it wasn't possible to achieve that kind of informal consolidation just by bringing it all to the mix in the sentences and the stories the whole time. Instead, we wanted to do very formalized consolidation. And you'll notice when you have a flick through book 2 that we now have grey boxes in the core language sections, not just yellow boxes. The yellow boxes have the new material, but the grey boxes are consolidation sections. And you can see as you flip through the chapters that there are regular notes to bring back material from the past to help it grow stronger. It's also the case that additional language actually has a section D in book 2. And the section D materials are all available online, but they're indicated within the hard copy textbook. At the end of each additional language section, there's a quick summary of what section D materials are available for that chapter. And the section D materials is a very systematic recap of vocab and endings. So, for example, a section D material might deal with all the first declension nouns the students have met so far, and then the first declension endings. And we thought we'd bring that in so that teachers can use very, very structured revision materials to take a whole block of vocab that's all of the same grammatical nature and then practice the endings that apply to those words. And it's worth my saying that for students who find Latin harder, the section D materials are really, really, really useful for them because it's focused on one particular type of linguistic processing, one particular category of word at any point in time. And there's lots and lots of practice, both of vocab building and drilling the endings for that type of word. The other thing that's new for book 2, and it was sort of kind of there in the background a little bit in book 1, but it really comes to the fore in book 2, is we wanted book 2 to really offer a lead in to set text work as well. And the way we wanted to lead into the set text wasn't just in culture and content, which was going to set the scene for the sorts of set text that students might read, Virgil in particular, but we wanted to start to sow the seeds for literary appreciation. So some of the notes in the core language yellow boxes are on word order. Students are encouraged to think about emphatic word order patterns. I had quite a lot of fun when I was writing the stories, putting things like chiasmuses in, putting in kind of classic Latinate word order patterns used for emphasis. And when students do the comprehension tasks, which are there as online materials to reinforce 2 of the stories in each chapter, for book 2, stylistic analysis questions are asked within those comprehension materials, so that students can get used to building in an appreciation of how something has been said, as opposed to just what has been said. And as was the case in book 1, personal response is also there, and the comprehension questions. And the aim is that through doing those comprehension questions, students will get used to the sorts of questions they might be asked about their set texts as and when they get there. So I promised a kind of a quick intro into the language syllabus and explain why we structured it as we had, and the kind of the things I'm going to talk about quite briefly now before I hand over to Sonia are the following questions. Why we left pronouns late and why they're quite a big deal when they come in book 2, why we chose to spend quite so long on the passive, 4 chapters to gradually unfold it, why we didn't put the subjunctive or deponent verbs into De Romanis book 2, and why we introduced indirect statement and the adjective absolute, but in their simplest forms only. So I'll deal with each of these in turn. The first question, so what about pronouns? Well, pronouns are really important words, as we all know, but they're actually quite difficult, not just because their forms are really fiddly in Latin, but they're difficult in English because they are the words that change their forms most in English. And one of the reasons why students find words like is, a, id so difficult isn't just because it's hard to recognize it when they meet it, but because they're going to translate it as he or him or his or she or her or hers or it or its or they or them or that or those. And that quantity of English forms puts a degree of difficulty in, which is unusual in the context of anything that's akin to a noun in Latin. Because for their standard nouns, like e.g., servus, slave, servus means slave, kind of whichever way you cut it, but the pronouns have that much slipperier sense of meaning because of the range of English that changes alongside it. So we deliberately left pronouns late because we wanted students to have a chance to practice things like case structure with words that were easier to handle, i.e. basic nouns, and then the pronouns come in book 2 as an opportunity to build on that and actually open students' eyes to the fact that we do have cases in English as well, and they manifest themselves in our English pronouns. The reason we spent so long on the passive is because the passive has the potential to be really, really difficult. And it's one of those things that really divides people. But the students who are really natural intuitive linguists, a flip from the active to the passive is easy peasy and scarcely needs explaining. But for students who are not intuitive linguists, the passive needs much longer, largely because we don't use it very much in English because it's so unwieldy. And it's quite hard to use in English because, as I say, it's so unwieldy. And therefore, when students are learning passive forms, the Latin form, e.g. regebar, is comparatively straightforward, one word, but they have to pin that onto a quite complex English form, 4 words, I was being ruled. And it's also an English form which uses words that crop up in other tenses. So the word was suddenly crops up, not just in the imperfect active, but in the perfect passive and the imperfect passive as well. And because of that room for potential confusion, and because of the need to develop competency in the passive in English as well, we were very much of the opinion that the passive is best dealt with very, very slowly, with lots and lots of consolidation work. And if you get into chapter 9 onwards, you'll notice that quite a lot of the tasks are there to practice handling the passive in English and not just in Latin. And we've come to realise that making sure students master it in their own language really helps them find the Latin version of it to be more straightforward. The reason then why we didn't bring in the subjunctive or deponent verbs is because actually the subjunctive is nowhere near as difficult as people think in the context of GCSE. It's really, really hard for A-level, but in the context of GCSE, where it's really going to sit in a subordinate clause and it's not going to be particularly challenging to translate, the subjunctive doesn't need a huge amount of time spent on it. And we wanted to spend our time on things that really would benefit from being done slowly. The subjunctive one can do really quite quickly if you want to. And similarly, deponent verbs, deponent verbs often get bundled up with the passive, but the passive is hard enough anyway without putting deponent verbs in the mix and saying, oh, right, here's a verb that looks passive and actually it's active. And I'm very much of the opinion that if you teach the passive properly and get the passive really secure, then deponent verbs are fine because it's no new forms, it's just remembering to translate them as active. But if you try and do the two at once, it becomes so confusing. What you lose are the students who are not the natural linguists. And right from the get-go, De Romanis was designed to be a course which would work for people who find Latin difficult, as well as those who want to munch up the grammar as quick as can be. And that same principle of wanting the course to be a course which would smoothly and steadily introduce the more difficult bits of Latin grammar is again the rationale why indirect statement and the ablative absolute are in, but in their simplest form only. Those two constructions are harder constructions than all of the syntax for GCSE that has a kind of opening word. All your subordinate clauses, like a purpose clause with the ut or the nay, are much easier than either indirect statement or the ablative absolute because the opening word is there. There's a word in Latin like ut, which directly pins to the opening words in English. The challenge with the indirect statement and the ablative absolute is everyone has to remember to put the word in English, to put the word that in for indirect statement, to start with the word with for the ablative absolute and then to convert it. And because there's a need to insert a word that is not there in the Latin, these two constructions are harder than some of the constructions that might seem on the surface to be more complicated. And therefore we wanted to introduce them in their simplest form only in book 2, so there's time for them to settle and then build over time as teachers move through to the more complicated forms, the different tenses that exist on the GCSE syllabus. I think there's a lot of benefit in kind of sowing the seed early and then coming back to it and coming back to it. And that's why it is in. So that was the kind of overview of the language syllabus. I'm now going to pass over to Sonia. Sonia, shall I do the kind of next slide, please, roll? And you can tell me when to pass on to the next one.
That would be brilliant if you would, please. Thank you. So on the culture and context front, as Catherine was saying about the language, there's a lot of consistency between book 1 and book 2. The structure of it is the same in culture and context. So we start out the chapters with the theme for each chapter, and it sort of takes you through, as Catherine was saying, the broader picture of Roman history. But there are some differences from book 1 and book 2. What we really start to see in book 2 is that we move away from myth into better attested history. So whereas the stories in book 1 are fantastical and the characters that we meet are truly characters, they're gods and heroes and individuals that may or may not ever have existed, we start to get into areas of attested history. So we can encourage students to think about the individuals that they read about as actual people. And it gives a much more linear route, starting out with sort of the growth and the eventual demise of the Republic and the rise of the Empire. And what I've found from teaching this book is that students really come in with absolutely no clue about the difference. They'll be familiar with the terms Roman Republic and Roman Empire, but it does take a little bit of teasing apart to get them to really understand in their heads, okay, what's the timeline of that? And as Catherine referenced, the timeline at the beginning is really, really useful for that. There are all sorts of areas that are ripe for discussion about systems of government, about political maneuvering. There's a lot of really meaty stuff to really get their teeth into. And usually at about this time, they are, in our school anyway, they do this section in year 9. And students are really starting to think about, oh, is this something I want to carry on with at GCSE? And sometimes in year 9, we can see some students start to disengage a bit. But I think the high level of interest and the different topics that we cover in the different themes for each chapter, there's something there for everyone. And so even if they're not going to be interested in carrying on with Latin, there is still so much for them to learn about the fundamental aspects and the fundamental individuals that really helped shape Roman history. So the stories and characters that you'll find in Book 2 include some of the most famous tales and some of the most recognizable names. And this provides a context for the stories and for the set text that they are most likely to encounter if they do carry on at GCSE. But there's a number of other paths to explore for students who might not be carrying on. Now, the aim for the culture and context section for Book 2 was really to provide this clear overview of the major people and the events that shaped Rome. So each chapter includes not just historical facts, but other aspects that encourage students to reflect on bigger questions. So if we could advance the slide, please. And there's a lot of cross-curricular scope here. So in chapter 7, we get bigger concepts like what is power, different types of power, who has power. There's plenty in there about political corruption. And we put the political on a personal level with some really dramatic characters like Publius Horatius killing his sister and Tarquinius raping Lucretia. There's a lot to dig into there. It is anything but boring. Even if you're not particularly interested in history, the stories sweep you up because they are stories of actual people. Chapter 8, moving on, we dig deeply into Cicero, not just his public life, but the private man, his grief for his daughter. And there's a great deal in there about the importance of speaking well, which is a great opportunity for students that like to talk, and we've all got them, to try their hand at a bit of public speaking. It's not so easy to speak persuasively and well if you're really trying to do it properly. Chapter 9, it's all about military logistics. We get into the Civil War. So it deals with questions such as what made the Roman army so formidable? Most students, when asked, will be able to tell you the Roman army, yes, it was very impressive. But so few of them are able to articulate why that is. And chapter 9 also gives us this really interesting view into the multifaceted personality that was Julius Caesar. A very, very impressive guy, but he had some serious flaws as well, and we cover those. The concept of civil war is also in there. So it's a great opportunity to explore what happens when two opposing parties are both absolutely convinced that they are correct. Chapter 10 is my personal favorite because it's all about Cleopatra. And Cleopatra, of course, is a woman best remembered for who she went to bed with. But she was an incredible individual, an astute politician, a capable leader. There's plenty there for people who are interested in all sorts of different aspects of history, as well as a feminist slant. Lots in there, and of course, a major turning point in Roman history. Chapter 11 gives us the opportunity to look into Augustus and how he leveraged the power of propaganda. So there's plenty of scope here for digging into the power of persuasion through both written and visual media. And we look at the way literature in particular was able to help win hearts and minds. And questions like what price are you willing to pay for peace and prosperity come to the fore in chapter 11. Chapter 12 is all about Roman Britain, which in another way of phrasing it is, defeated Britain. It really brings it home. The Romans were here. They conquered here. These things happened. What was the cost of that? And what were the benefits? So these topics not only provide for a really solid understanding of the fundamental events and the fundamental concepts of the changing face of Rome, but there's also prime opportunities here for expanding both across the curriculum and into things that are more tangentially curricular, like the concepts of British values. Book 2 absolutely covers them all: democracy, individual liberty, rule of law, tolerance for different faiths, individual liberty. They're all in there. So there's plenty of opportunity for bringing those in. A lot of the concepts in Book 2 are also issues that will be discussed in PSHE lessons or make really excellent writing prompts, which of course promote literacy and get in that all-important handwriting practice. And there's a range of other activities that allow teachers to get as creative as they like. Last year, my Year 9 students were absolutely thrilled that I gave them an entire period to draw some really incredible posters that illustrated Plutarch's description of Cleopatra sailing to meet Mark Antony, and they did such an amazing job. The level of detail that they got in there, irrespective of their artistic ability, was really, really impressive to see. So with the culture and context in Book 2, ultimately by using sort of a combination of the notes, the sources, the images, we have tried to make the people and the events come alive. As I was saying before, so much of the focus in book 1 is mythological, and therefore students know it's not really real. But book 2 is full of individuals who are, or rather were, largely real people. They lived, they loved, they fought, they won, they lost. But ultimately, they all left an impression on the world that is so deep, we are still feeling the effects of it today. And so the joy of book 2 for me really lies in getting students to think about these individuals as people. And that's the fun of culture and context in book 2. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I think I've just completely messed it up. There we are. Right, so that is us on the presentation, and I think we're now at the halfway point, well, just near about the half-hour point, and we can pass over to Sarah for questions.
Yep, lovely, thank you. Don't know whether you both want to come back on screen because I can't. Oh, I can see you.
I hope I'm on. Am I on now? Okay.
Yeah, you're on. Just nice to see your faces. We've had a few questions in, but one of the main one I thought I'd just quickly ask now is, what year group do you introduce book 2? Is there a set?
So there's no set requirement. I mean, the flexible design was there to try and make sure that it could be used in any context. And we as authors were very alert to the fact that some people have Latin in year 7, some people start Latin in year 6, in year 5, in year 8, in year 9, And the reason for this concertina structure was because different people just have differing amounts of teaching time. And within that program, some people are awash with lessons, some people kind of scarcely get to see their kids because it's half an hour a week or whatever. So, the question of when to introduce it really depends on the time you have available. And one of the reasons why we designed the course as a 12-chapter structure was because 12 is the number that cuts as many different ways as possible. So we hoped it would fit kind of neatly into whatever the structures you have in terms of how many years worth of Latin. But I think the main answer is we happen to use it in year 9. We find it works really well in year 9. But because the course gets so far down the route to GCSE, actually, if you were doing it in year 10, you would still have time to get to GCSE comfortably. And one of the things we've realised in our own school is actually there's no value in rushing through this material. When we first started, we had a much faster scheme of work than we have now. We realised that actually slowing it down really benefits the younger students. We get to make much more of the culture and content. And actually, when they move to GCSE and they're kind of older and they can do a faster work rate anyway, they quite enjoy the speed of ramping it up a bit. So there's no one particular answer, except to say that this is not a course that has to be finished before GCSE. It should be seen as part of the run into GCSE, and there's far less to do at the end of it than maybe some people might have realised at the outset.
Brilliant. I had an interesting question about the recruitment from year 9 to GCSE Latin. Someone has asked about what you think is the most important element of recruitment. They've got a couple of options here: scaffolded Latin exercises that give a sense of achievement for all, or the source material that opens Latin out into the ancient world, and how could De Romanis be best used so as not to sacrifice one or the other?
Yeah, I think it's probably a question for us both to answer because we probably had different experiences. I think my kind of tuppence worth is that I think the two things that really pull students in is, first of all, being clear about their own progress. And we find the consolidation exercises really good because actually they really show the kids they're making progress. Because the problem is if you relentlessly only do new stuff, you never notice your progress because it never gets any easier and you never get any better at it, right? It's always new. But when you consolidate, you think, oh my gosh, I really can do that now. I remembered finding that slightly harder, 6 months ago, and look at me now, So we find that book 2 really cements a sense of Latin is a subject I'm getting better at. And that's a really strong recruiter to GCSE. And then the other thing that pulls kids in is when they're interested and when they think. And as Sonia was saying, I mean, honestly, that we have such interesting conversations with the kids that we teach. I used to teach incredibly boring lessons, and I'm sort of amazed at myself now at how often I talk about something which I would say is really interesting, because there's not a single story that goes by where you can't have a conversation that ties into who are we? Who are they? What do we think is important? What is good? What is dark? How do we construct societies that are going to make progress? And I think that really genuine, serious, high-level interest really pulls kids in. Sonia, I'll pass over to you.
I would say also that with the way things are arranged with these books, you don't sacrifice one for the other. They are part and parcel of each other. So the interesting bits that you will read about in the introductory culture and context section those are the stories that you're going to be reading about. Those characters that are originally flagged up, that's what the stories are about. So you might, look through a source, which is Plutarch telling the story, and then you read the Latin story that is the same thing. And that's really, really useful, because when students have that context, they know the bare bones of the story, the shape of it, who's supposed to do what to whom. It aids in their translation. And it really cements both the concepts of grammar and vocabulary and also that story and those characters and what happened. So they really go hand in hand.
On that vein as well, we've had a question about the progression to GCSE and what is left, excuse me, what is left still to do at the end of book 2 to prepare them for GCSE level?
So not, as I say, not a huge amount, because it's stuff which is either not so difficult or less important, right? So if you think about nouns, what's left are the fourth declension nouns and the fifth declension nouns, but there's such a tiny number of fourth and fifth declension nouns on the GCSE syllabus that, even though the endings are, important to those nouns, they're just not going to meet those nouns that often because there's so few of them. So the big things are fourth and fifth declension nouns, all the subordinate clauses that use the subjunctive, so purpose, result, indirect command, fearing, and so on. That sounds like a whole long list, but actually it's far, far quicker than some people think, because once you teach the opening hook, hook means in order to, hook means so that, hook means, in fear that, actually they kind of rattle along quite quickly. The more complicated versions of the adjective absolute and the indirect statement and opponent verbs, and there's some tiny little bits of like certain pronouns. But those are the core areas, and a bit of vocab. There's about 100, just under 100 words left to do. And then the set texts. But of course, the set texts, although they are new, firing up the interest and firing up the context, which is going to help those texts feel familiar. So I'm teaching set texts at the moment, and for the first time ever in my teaching career, I've opened up the story of Aeneas to a class, all of whom knew who Aeneas was, all of whom understood who Virgil was, all got the fact this was a poem written at a time of civil war, and they knew that before I opened my mouth. And that transformed their relationship with Virgil, because it hooked into something they already found interesting. And even though we're now wading through the difficulty of the Latin text, they've signed up to the project because it feels like a culmination of something they've been building up to, as opposed to this kind of weird add-on that's been shoved in the GCSE course, but they never really thought about it until then.
I've got a question about keeping a large class engaged in classical civilization stories.
Sonia, can I pass over to you?
Yeah, that can be tricky, and it really depends. If you've got a large class who all happen to be dead keen and really well behaved, of course you're going to do things differently. I guess it would really all depend. I would say keeping a large class engaged, the content itself is pretty darned engaging. So it's a matter of figuring out what are the activities that you're going to do. So it needs to be something that is sufficiently challenging so that everybody is interested and feels like, oh, this is something I actually have to work at and use my brain for, but also sufficiently attainable so that everyone feels like this is an accomplishable task that they can participate in. And that can be quite difficult. Now, with, for example, the sources that we have, each one has a series of questions after it. And those source questions begin pretty straightforwardly. The first couple of them tend to be more retrieval tasks, and they ramp up in their complexity. The later questions are much more broadly based. So, one option is to think about, okay, do I want to, divide out these questions among the class based on their attainment levels, ones that I know will be more appropriate for certain students. So things of that nature, and then bringing everybody back to present to one another is a good way to do that when you've got that many people, because you simply won't have time with all the class wrangling to get through them all and to lead a discussion with that many. But you can help ameliorate that by dividing them up into smaller groups, a divide and conquer, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what Sonia's kind of brought to the fore is, we've talked quite a lot about how the language materials were structured at different difficulty points. Well, so too the culture and context materials are structured at different difficulty points. So, if you've only got 5 minutes and it's the end of, period 8 on a Friday, then you can use any of the images as a hook and just put the image on the board and tell the story based on the image. Immediate access, immediate kind of, engagement from the kids. Or you can use a bit of the extended background material and do, you know, a kind of reading comprehension task, or you can go into the sources, which are a bit harder still. And then, as Sonia says, you can choose which of those questions you want to use, or you can go to the questions for discussion, which are the overview questions that pull it all together. So in terms of keeping a large class engaged, you need to think, what time have you got? What interests have you got amongst the kids? What are the varying needs in terms of attainment? And then choose one of our resources to fit that, because there's absolutely zero expectation that people have to do every single bit of the course. It's designed to be selective, and that applies just as much to the culture and content materials as it is to the language materials.
And I think you've just answered the next question, which is the structure of the textbooks and whether you front load the background info at the start of each chapter or leave it to the end of the chapter, or then you interweave it with the Latin you're encountering. But I think you've just answered that by saying how flexible the course is.
Yeah, and we've tried it different ways, haven't we? You know, we've tried interweaving and we've tried front loading, and different people like different things. And one of the things in the teacher's guide is there is at the end of the teacher's guide for each chapter details of which are the background material bits that connect with each story. So if you want to interweave it, you can literally, before you do a story, just put in some background, or you can have a cracking like couple of lessons where you go big on the background, make it all live, and then when you come to the stories, the kids are already interested in the stories because they've heard about them before. And I think one of the things we've really realised is, you know, yeah, when we read a novel, we might like to read a book where we don't know what happens, but actually what kids love is familiarity. You know, when do kids put their hands up? When they know the answer, you know, so familiarity in the classroom is so enabling. And if you kind of tell the story in advance, you're going to find the kids are twice as keen to do the story in Latin because they feel they already know what they're talking about, and they will jump straight in and crack on.
Absolutely. We've had another question about the digital resources, which we always love this question. So I don't know whether you want to just speak about the digital resources, where we can find them, and also how they work together with the textbooks.
Yeah, so Sonia, what are your favourite digital resources? We've got to talk about the map, but either Sonia or I can choose who's going to talk about the map. We've got to do a shout out to the map, but I'll pass over to Sonia.
We do have to do a shout out to the map. We're very, very proud of the map. I'll leave that to you, though, to sing its praises. Because for me, the comprehension worksheets are one of the most useful things. So there are comprehension worksheets for the stories, but there are also background worksheets for all of the content. So there's plenty there that's already done for you. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's worth looking through them. The comprehension worksheets, easily one of my favorites, because at the beginning of the comprehension worksheets for book 2, the first thing that students are asked to do is summarize. And this is the most telling thing. Getting students to summarize is such a useful skill, and they don't know how to do it inevitably when they first start being asked to summarize. So I'm going to say the comprehension worksheets for the stories, big favorite of mine, because they also have follow-up grammar questions. You've got everything you need there in one tidy package. And Catherine, the map.
I've got to put the map. Right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so, you know, the map nearly broke us as authors, but truly as a teacher, there is no resource that I've become more grateful for. So I'm hoping to share my screen. Have I shared my screen? No, open share screen. No, I've completely failed to share my screen. Right, here we go. We're away. We're cooking on gas. Right, here we go. So this is what the background, the online website, companion website looks like. Over here on the left-hand side, all the things that are available. Loads and loads of stuff, you know, PowerPoint presentations if you want to do a quick overview of the culture and context, worksheets for the background material, as well as worksheets that exist as comprehensions down here for the Latin stories. The worksheets for the background material, again, help people to summarize the core material. And actually, sometimes I teach a chapter just by the worksheet. So I give the worksheet and I tell them the answers to the questions, and then they have the kind of core material there. You know, video links, that's always good for a Friday afternoon. Quick quizzes, kids love it. They're kind of like pub quiz style quick quizzes on background. You know, really nice way of just doing a rattle through how much you know about this chapter. But the map, the infamous map. So, you know, the reason I love this map, I'm going to make it big, is, as Sonia said, you know, book 2 is real. And you can put this map up on the board at any point you like. And what we put on it, the reason we love it, is that every single place that we mention in De Romanis is located on the map. And this is why it took forever to put together, because we had to get all the positionings of all the places right. But it means whatever story you're doing, you know, if you're doing, for example, you know, a story about, Rome fighting against, the Sabines or whatever, you can put this up and say, right, we're here in the world and this is where the Sabines are and they're really close and therefore they're going to fight each other. And here's the Tiber in the middle, And the thing about the map is it allows the kids to take this Roman history and pin it tangibly onto our world. And all these colours also show how the Roman Empire expanded over time. So as a visual depiction of how Roman power grew, it's fantastic. And, if you're opening up, e.g. chapter 10 on Egypt, and you say, right, why is Alexandria so impressive? And you get into the whole idea of trade and sea lanes and how difficult it was to travel by land. With this map on the board, you can get the kids to understand how the reality of geography drives so much of history. And I now sound like a map evangelist, having spent all my teaching career thinking maps are a bit kind of awful. This map has transformed how much I feel we can give the content real anchors in the world around us today. So I love it. That's the map. Right, I'm going to come off screen share.
I do love it as well. I think it's great. And I love a normal map as well. So a bit of a map geek. I'm just going to leave this for 5 minutes just to see if anyone else has any questions, or if you want to come on and unmute yourself and ask a question to the authors, that's absolutely fine. Give it a couple minutes. But the last question I have is, how are students responding to it? And I think it's quite a nice question to end the session on. You're both teaching it, so I just wondered whether you had any responses from the students themselves.
So, Nathan, do you want to go first and then I'll jump in?
Well, that's an interesting question. So if you'd asked me this 2 years ago, my answer would have been different, because we had students that had previously started learning Latin using a different textbook series. And so, of course, teenagers are inherently conservative. Anything different is bad. And there was a little bit of resistance to it at first, but that disappeared very, very quickly. Students found that it was more interesting in content to them. I have had a number of people that started out with a different textbook who later came to tell me that they did prefer the content of this one, that it was more interesting for a wide variety of different reasons. Those who have known nothing but De Romanis, we did not have to deal with that problem with them. And by and large, they are responding to it very well indeed, particularly in the younger years. I know today is all about book 2. But book 1, the students are younger and therefore just naturally more keen and enthusiastic, and are much more effusive and excited about the various different stories that we talk about and the characters we encounter. When they get a bit too cool for school is usually when we get into book 2. So they're not as, demonstrative in their positive affection for school books. But generally speaking, I would say extremely positively, particularly with my year 11s. They are now they haven't done De Romanis in over a year, and they're still frequently referencing things that they learned in De Romanis that they are encountering in their past papers or in the readings that we're doing from the John Taylor book. So yeah, there's been a very positive response as far as I'm concerned. Catherine?
Yeah, I'd say so. It's partly because as a teacher, I'm a whole load more interested in this than I ever was in any of the stuff I taught before. And, we all know as teachers that when you're teaching from the heart and you love what you're teaching, it always goes better than if you're not. But I also think that what I particularly can see in the students is it doesn't matter what lesson I'm teaching and to whom. We've got a really broad ability range in our school. I can ask questions in any De Romanis lesson, which either I'm confident the kids are going to get right, and that's really powerful because it builds their confidence, or I can ask questions which are going to have to make them think. And I can ask questions that are going to have to make them think either on matters of Latin grammar or on matters of kind of cultural content. And I hope that what the kids feel is they learn a lot of interesting things, but they have lessons where each lesson can contain those 2 core ingredients: questions where they can get the answers right, and questions where they have to pause and think a bit harder, and then maybe are aware of how they've moved on in their own understanding as a result. So, we find enthusiasm is really strong. And actually, in terms of flow through to GCSE, our numbers are for GCSE, we're very kind of pleased and proud of our numbers. But more important than the raw numbers, when I track where those kids have come from, we find we are just as likely now to recruit from the kids who find Latin more challenging as we are from the kids who find Latin easy. And that breadth of uptake from across the ability range in the school is something which I think is really to be celebrated. And I think it's because De Romanis is a course which allows the kids to feel safe, they can see their progress, the consolidation work in book 2 really helps to build that confidence. And they're often just really interested in the Romans. And I don't blame them, because the Romans are actually really interesting. So yeah, good uptake.
Yeah, nice way to end. Excellent. Okay, I haven't got any additional questions, so I'm hoping that means that everyone's found it useful today. So thank you both so much, and I know that everyone's come on and it's 5:30, so I'm going to leave it there. The recording will be sent out and we'll also upload it to the companion website, so it's all in one place. So if, like I said at the beginning,